Hi, this is Dick Howe for RichardHowe.com. February's finally over. It was a long month. It actually had an extra day in it this year, and it was filled with 29 days that were all cold, dark, and snowy for the most part. But it was a great month for reading, for catching up on all the books that you got during the holiday period. And one book I read that I'd like to recommend to you is called Partners in Command. It's a joint biography of Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall during World War II and the post-war period. It's by Mark Perry. I found it to be a fascinating book. I think anybody that is interested in the history of World War II would really enjoy this book because it starts right at the beginning of the war, and it talks about how George C. Marshall, who was then the Chief of Staff of the Army, brought Dwight Eisenhower in to be his chief of the War Plans Division. Marshall had known Eisenhower for a long time, and throughout Marshall's career he had kept a book in which he wrote the names of officers who he thought would be very successful when they reached higher command. Eisenhower's name was in that, as were the names of George Patton and Omar Bradley, and a number of others who went on to become our most famous and successful combat commanders during World War II. But surprisingly, there were a number of individuals whose names were in that book who didn't work out so well once they got to the field. So it wasn't a perfect system, but it seemed to work pretty well. The way that Eisenhower got to be Marshall's assistant is a little strange. Another officer had been chosen for that post, but when he was flying to Washington from the West Coast to take that office, his plane crashed and he was killed. Desperate or anxious to get somebody into the position, Marshall opened up his book, thumbed through it, saw Eisenhower's name, and summoned him to Washington from Texas, where he was stationed at the time. Eisenhower was very disappointed in this because he wanted to command troops, which is what most officers want to do, certainly during times of war. But he came to Washington, and he very quickly became Marshall's right-hand man. Most of us have an image of Eisenhower as being a jovial, joking, pleasant person who was very easy to get along with. The strengths that we've all been told made him the perfect supreme commander during World War II. But I think one thing we never knew, and this book makes very clear, is that Eisenhower really had a brilliant mind and he was a terrific writer. There are many examples in the darkest days of the early phases of World War II when Marshall would give Eisenhower an assignment late in the afternoon to write a memo on a particular issue, and that when Marshall arrived the next morning, Eisenhower would have almost a perfect document ready for him to take to the President or the British Chiefs of Staff or whoever. And as Marshall and Eisenhower grew closer and closer, Eisenhower started learning how Marshall thought and what he thought about the war. And so when the British staff and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill came to Washington to plan the progress of the war, both Marshall and Eisenhower attended. And there was a real conflict between the British and the Americans. Both agreed that Germany had to be defeated first, but they disagreed on how that would happen. The British, who were really scarred very badly from the tremendous losses they had sustained during World War I, wanted to nibble at the edges, to attack Germany through the Mediterranean or up through Norway and Denmark. They didn't want a head-on confrontation in Central Europe, in France. They didn't want a repeat of World War I, a war that cost England hundreds of thousands of lives. In contrast, the Americans, who had only caught the tail end of World War I, wanted to get the job done. They wanted to get into France as quickly as possible because France was the road to Germany, and the way to defeat Germany was by fighting the Germans in Germany and beating them there. And it all sounded very aggressive and heroic, and it certainly was, but it also was a bit naive. because finally Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to go into Africa first in the early parts of the war. So the Americans landed in North Africa, and there they learned that the Germans were no pushover, that they were a professional army, they were well trained, and they were very tough opponents. But that conflict between the British and the Americans continued throughout the planning phases of the war and through the invasion of Europe and to the ultimate victory over Germany. And that is a big reason why Eisenhower became the supreme commander. See, originally everyone assumed that Marshall would be the supreme commander of all the troops in Germany, in Europe, invading Germany. That both the British and the Americans agreed that it was crucial to have a unified command, that each of the Allies wouldn't have their own command structure. There'd be one commander, and everybody, regardless of nationality, would work for him. Because it was clear the Americans were going to provide a disproportionate amount of the supplies and equipment and manpower, it was clear that the commander would be an American. Everyone assumed it would be Marshall, but early in the war his duties in Washington were so critical that he couldn't be spared. And so they designated Eisenhower to be his chief of staff and sent him on ahead to England to begin planning and preparing, because he knew full well how Marshall would want to fight the war once he arrived. But Eisenhower did very well when he was there, and the British, particularly Churchill, liked him, and they finally decided that he was the one that would be the supreme commander. Now, this book follows the war through North Africa, into Sicily, Italy, the invasion of Normandy, the fight across France, and into Germany. And there's great portraits of all of the main characters on the Allied side in Europe. There's certainly Marshall and Eisenhower, but there are also there's a lot of information about Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, American Generals Omar Bradley, George Patton, and dozens of others that you'd certainly be familiar with. But the book doesn't end with the end of the war, because Marshall and Eisenhower both continued their service into the post-war period. And they brought with them from the war kind of a validation of their idea that alliances were critical. And that's where things such as NATO came from, that it was Marshall who put together the plan that created NATO, and Eisenhower was actually the first commander of NATO. There are some difficult periods for the two men. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Marshall was Truman's Secretary of State, and he led the negotiations between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists. And of course the communists won out, and many in America, particularly in the Republican Party, blamed Marshall for losing China to the communists. And Marshall came under particular attention of Joe McCarthy during the McCarthy-era hearings, and McCarthy accused Marshall of coddling communists in the State Department and in the Army. And it would have been natural for Eisenhower to come to Marshall's defense, but by that time Eisenhower already had his sights set on the presidency, and as much as he sincerely wanted to speak out in favor of Marshall, his advisors made it quite clear to him that if he did go up against McCarthy, that it would kill his political career. And so Eisenhower chose to remain silent. And I'm sure that damaged the relationship between the two men, but it certainly didn't put an end to it, because they continued to work together even through Eisenhower's presidency. This book, Partners in Command, is not only a great history, it's a great management book. It's full of examples of how a subordinate should work with the boss, and how the boss should deal with subordinates and colleagues. It's an excellent book. So once again, the name of the book is Partners in Command. It's a joint biography of George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower during World War II and the post-war period. I strongly recommend it to you. Thanks for joining us for another video on richardhowe.com.